Welcome back to another deep dive into the darkest corners of Fallout lore. Today we're exploring one of the most chilling secrets buried beneath Alaska's frozen wasteland, the Deep Echo Network, a series of military bunkers that made Vault-Tech's experiments look tame by comparison. This is the confession you weren't supposed to hear. Let's begin. They told us Anchorage was reclaimed in January 2077, but they never mentioned what we buried beneath the permafrost, facilities so classified that even the Enclave's records showed nothing but redacted files and phantom budget entries. I spent 3 years stationed in Alaska's Deep Echo Network, where the temperature inside matched the ice outside, and the screaming from Sublevel 9 never stopped, no matter how thick the vault doors. General Chase may have won the surface war, but 2 miles beneath the tundra, we were losing something far worse. Our humanity, one frozen test subject at a time. My name doesn't matter anymore. What matters is that someone knows what we did up there, what's still down there, waiting in the ice. They recruited me in October 2074, pulled me straight out of Fort Strong with a security clearance so high it didn't even have a number, just a designation they called Umbra Protocol. The recruitment officer, a colonel whose eyes looked like they'd seen too many things that couldn't be unseen, sat me down in a windowless room and asked me one question. Can you keep a secret that will follow you to your grave and beyond? I said yes. I was 23 years old and thought I understood what sacrifice meant. I was wrong. The transport to Alaska took 16 hours in a cargo plane with no windows and no insignia. We weren't allowed to know our coordinates, weren't allowed to carry anything with personal identification. They issued us new dog tags with serial numbers that didn't exist in any database. The man sitting next to me, a medic from Texas whose hands shook the entire flight, whispered that his sister worked for Vault-Tech and she'd told him about facilities that made the vaults look like summer camps. He disappeared 3 weeks into training. They said he requested a transfer. We all knew better. Site Omega Black sprawled beneath 3,000 feet of Alaskan permafrost, so deep that even our Geiger counters couldn't detect surface radiation when the Great War eventually came. The entrance sat camouflaged inside an abandoned mining operation near the Yukon River, one of 17 sites spread across Alaska in a network they called Deep Echo. Each facility was named after a dead president, and ours, Eisenhower Complex, was the largest. The day I first descended that elevator, dropping for 7 minutes straight into the frozen earth, I counted my breaths to stay calm. By the time we reached bottom, I'd counted to 412. The air tasted wrong, metallic and sharp, like breathing through a mouthful of copper pennies. Temperature regulation was our greatest challenge and our best defense. The facility maintained an ambient temperature of negative 40 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to preserve everything indefinitely, warm enough to keep critical systems from shattering. We wore specialized cold weather gear developed by West Tech, triple-layered suits with heating elements powered by microfusion cells. Even with the suits, my fingers ached constantly. The veterans, the ones who'd been down there since 2067 when construction finished, moved through the cold like it was nothing. Their faces had a blue-gray tint to the skin, and I later learned why. But that discovery came much later, after I'd already seen too much to ever leave mentally intact. My clearance was level 6, which meant I could access about 40% of the complex. The facility operated on a need-to-know basis so strict that even colonels only knew their specific sectors. I worked in Sublevel 7 of the main operational wing, maintaining life support systems and monitoring atmospheric conditions. The job sounded mundane until I realized what the life support systems were supporting. Row after row of cryogenic suspension pods, thousands of them, stretching into chambers so vast the far walls disappeared into frozen mist. Each pod contained what the manifests called assets. I called them people, until the day I looked too close at one and saw that the person inside had too many limbs, their skin covered in frost patterns that moved when I wasn't looking directly at them. The first time I heard the screaming, I was 42 days into my assignment. It started around 0300 hours, echoing through the ventilation system from somewhere deep below my station. The sound wasn't quite human, too layered, like multiple voices trying to scream through the same throat simultaneously. My supervisor, a lieutenant named Graves who never smiled and rarely slept, told me it was pressure equalization in the ice shelf, structural settling, he said, but pressure doesn't beg for help in 3 different languages while describing experiments that haven't been declassified yet. I filed a report. Graves shredded it in front of me and suggested I focus on my assigned duties unless I wanted to become part of the research program myself. The Deep Echo Network connected all 17 sites through underground maglev trains that ran through tunnels carved into bedrock and reinforced with experimental materials. Supply runs came every 72 hours, arriving from staging areas we weren't allowed to know about. The trains carried frozen supplies, equipment, and what the manifest called volunteers. These volunteers wore prison uniforms from military detention facilities and had expressions of people who'd accepted that their appeals had failed. The first time I helped unload one of these shipments, a man grabbed my arm and asked me to tell his daughter in Anchorage that he loved her. Security dragged him away before I could respond. I never saw him again, but 6 months later, I saw his name on a successful transformation report for Subject Group Alpha. He'd become something they called a Frostwalker. Document 447, Nero changed everything. I found it by accident, tucked inside a radiation suit I'd borrowed from a colleague who'd been transferred to Site Roosevelt. The document was dated August 2076, classified Level 12, which was 6 levels above my clearance. Reading it should have gotten me executed. Not reading it would have left me ignorant of the true horror of our work. The document detailed something called enhanced interrogation through controlled hypothermia and consciousness fragmentation. They weren't just preserving people in the cold, they were using extreme temperature exposure combined with biochemical agents to break down human consciousness and rebuild it into something that could survive conditions no human should endure. The Chinese never knew about Deep Echo. Their invasion of Alaska focused on oil pipelines and strategic military targets, but our facilities sat too deep and too cold for their infiltrators to detect. Our thermal signature was deliberately designed to match natural permafrost patterns. But we knew about them. Every Chinese prisoner captured on the Anchorage front line had a chance of ending up in our processing centers. I witnessed the intake procedure once. They stripped the prisoners, injected them with something that made their veins glow blue under ultraviolet light, and sent them down to the restricted zones. The guards who handled intake rotated every 2 weeks. The suicide rate among those guards was 73%. Each bunker in the network housed its own nuclear reactor, massive assemblies buried beneath frozen bedrock. The reactors were designed to run for 500 years without surface contact or maintenance. Our engineers bragged that even if the surface world ended in nuclear fire, the Deep Echo Network would continue operating, preserving its terrible secrets until someone finally dug deep enough to find them. The reactor in Eisenhower Complex sat in sublevel 15, 9 levels below my station. I only saw it once during an emergency drill. The control room looked like the inside of a cathedral, all vertical space and humming machinery, with technicians who spoke in whispers like they were afraid of waking something sleeping in the reactor core. Project Lazarus North was the cover name for our primary research initiative. The official goal, according to our briefing materials, was developing soldiers capable of operating in extreme Arctic conditions for extended periods. The unofficial goal, which everyone understood but nobody discussed openly, was creating a new type of human being. They used variants of something called the forced evolutionary virus, adapted specifically for cold environment integration. The science team called it forced evolutionary virus variant, absolute 0. The rest of us called it the Blue Death because subjects exposed to it turned crystalline blue before either dying or transforming into something that no longer qualified as human. I met Subject 07 Alpha on my 203rd day underground. He was a former Marine who'd volunteered for extended service, though I doubted the voluntary nature of that decision. He existed in what they called a semi-suspended state, his brain preserved in a nutrient solution inside a clear tank, connected to a network of tubes and sensors that kept him technically alive. He could still communicate through a text interface. I made the mistake of reading his messages during a maintenance check. He was still trying to report for duty, still following protocols, still believing he was serving his country. The messages ended with him asking when his tour would be over so he could see his wife in Seattle. His wife had died in 2071. Nobody had told him. The hydroponic gardens in sublevel 10 grew food under purple ultraviolet lights, massive crops of vegetables that tasted subtly wrong no matter how they were prepared. I worked a shift helping the agriculture team during a staffing shortage. The plants grew too fast, their root systems spread with an intelligence that seemed almost deliberate, and if you listened carefully, you could hear them rustling when nobody was moving through the aisles. The lead botanist, Dr. Chen, explained that the seeds had been exposed to low-level radiation and growth accelerants developed by West Tech. She didn't mention why some of the plants had what looked like teeth growing along their stems, or why we occasionally found small animals that had wandered into the gardens, transformed into plant-like things that photosynthesized and screamed. Communications protocols demanded complete radio silence with the surface. We used hardline connections only, miles and miles of fiber optic cable frozen into the ice, connecting us to command centers that might or might not have survived the war. Every message was routed through relay stations, encrypted 3 times, and purged from local systems immediately after transmission. My commanding officer, Colonel Matheson, drank himself unconscious every night in his private quarters, mumbling about the ones in storage and what we'll do when they thaw. I helped carry him to his bunk twice. Both times he grabbed my uniform and made me promise I'd kill him if he ever started showing signs of exposure. I promised, though I had no idea what exposure meant until much later. The emergency protocols were crystal clear. In case of nuclear war, all blast doors seal automatically, surface access terminates permanently, and deep echo transitions to autonomous operation for a minimum of 2 centuries. We drilled these protocols monthly. The drills always ended with the same recorded message from a general whose name was redacted. In the message, he thanked us for our service to America and reminded us that our sacrifice ensures humanity's survival through the coming darkness. If you're still with me after hearing this, hit that like and subscribe button. The oldest bunker, Site Alpha Eden, predated the Anchorage frontline by 4 years. Somebody knew this war was coming long before China invaded in 2066. I found evidence of construction contracts dated to 2062, buried in maintenance logs that should have been erased decades ago. The contracts listed companies that didn't officially exist and funding sources that bypassed congressional oversight entirely. Site Alpha Eden contained the prototype freezing chambers, earlier models that didn't regulate temperature correctly. The failure rate in those early units was 98%, which meant thousands of test subjects died screaming as ice crystals formed in their cells and shredded them from within. They left the bodies in place as a reminder of how far the program had come. Sublevel 12 required a full NBC suit to investigate. The temperature there dropped so low that sound itself seemed to freeze mid-propagation, your voice trailing behind your words like a ghost trying to catch up. I requisitioned a suit and went down there once, accompanying a repair team fixing an atmospheric sensor. The walls were thick with ice buildup, crystalline formations that reflected our flashlights in patterns that looked deliberately arranged. At the far end of a corridor that shouldn't have existed according to the facility maps, I saw a door marked with a designation I didn't recognize. Site Omega Black Classified Research Wing Station Fenris. The door was warm to the touch, despite the ambient temperature. I asked the repair chief about it. He told me to forget I'd seen it, and his hand moved toward his sidearm when he said it. The success rate for the Frostwalker program was 7%. 7% of subjects survived the transformation process and emerged as something that could function in conditions that would kill a power-armored soldier. I watched one during a containment breach in Sublevel 9. Security lockdown trapped me in an observation gallery while this former human, survived exposure to -80 degrees for 6 hours. It moved through the freezing air like a swimmer through water, frost forming and shedding from its body in waves. Its eyes had turned completely white, but it could see perfectly. When maintenance finally restored heat to the sector, the Frost Walker didn't die. It just looked disappointed. The Chinese offensive of 2076 nearly reached Site Lincoln, our northernmost facility, positioned just 60 miles from the front lines. Their scouts penetrated to within 2 miles of the surface entrance before retreating in absolute panic. After action reports, we intercepted described impossible temperature readings and atmospheric anomalies that caused equipment failure and psychological breakdown. 3 Chinese soldiers were found frozen solid 15 miles from our perimeter, their expressions suggesting they died seeing something their minds couldn't process. We never claimed the bodies. The permafrost did that work for us, preserving them as warning monuments that eventually disappeared under fresh snowfall and deliberate memory. I started planning my escape on day 212, the same day I found my own name on a transfer manifest to long-term preservation studies. The manifest listed 47 personnel scheduled for voluntary integration into Project Lazarus North. My name appeared third from the bottom, flagged with a priority code that meant immediate processing. I confronted Graves about it, demanded to know why I'd been selected when my service record was exemplary and my psychological evaluations showed no signs of instability. He looked at me with something that might have been pity and explained that's exactly why I'd been selected. They needed stable minds for the advanced consciousness transfer experiments. Unstable minds fragmented too easily during the freezing process. That night, I accessed systems I had no authorization to touch, using credentials I'd stolen from a dead technician whose body I'd helped transport to the crematorium. The Deep Echo database sprawled across encrypted servers buried in Sublevel 18, protected by security protocols that would trigger immediate containment if breached incorrectly. I had one chance to get this right. The login worked. The technician had level 9 clearance, 3 levels above mine, and his access hadn't been revoked because officially he'd been transferred to Site Washington, not dissolved in the industrial accident that scattered his component molecules across an experimental fusion chamber. What I found in those files destroyed any remaining illusions about the nobility of our work. Project Lazarus North was just the surface layer. Beneath it sat Project Eternal Winter, an initiative that made Frostwalkers look like a humanitarian effort. The goal was creating a suspended civilization, thousands of modified humans capable of hibernating for centuries in frozen stasis, then awakening when conditions permitted to rebuild America according to predetermined parameters. But the modification process required breaking down human consciousness completely, extracting memories and personality fragments, then reassembling them into simplified template patterns that could survive repeated freeze and thaw cycles. The files contained video logs from the early trials. I watched 3 minutes before my stomach forced me to stop. The subjects weren't sedated during initial consciousness extraction. They needed to be aware, their neural patterns active and firing for the process to map correctly. The screams I'd been hearing through the ventilation system weren't pressure equalization. They were echoes of ongoing procedures 9 levels below my station, sound waves traveling through frozen metal and stone, carrying fragments of shattered minds begging for death that wouldn't come because death meant experiment failure, and failure meant the process would repeat with another subject. Site, Roosevelt grew the contaminated vegetables I'd tasted, but that wasn't its primary function. Roosevelt specialized in biological integration studies, combining human tissue with plant matter to create hybrid organisms capable of photosynthesizing in low-light conditions. The theory suggested future colonization scenarios where food couldn't be transported efficiently and survivors would need to generate their own nutrition through solar absorption. The reality involved people slowly transforming into ambulatory plant systems, their skin turning green and leathery, their thoughts slowing and simplifying until they existed in a permanent dreamlike state, aware but unable to communicate, trapped inside bodies that were no longer entirely their own. I discovered the truth about the blue-gray skin tone during a medical inspection required after 6 months underground. The facility doctor, a woman named Captain Torres who looked like she hadn't slept in years, examined my hands under ultraviolet light and nodded with satisfaction. "The discoloration is progressing normally," she said, as if this was expected and acceptable. I demanded explanation. She sighed and told me that everyone stationed below sublevel 5 received modified atmospheric exposure. The air contained trace amounts of the forced evolutionary virus variant, not enough to trigger full transformation, but sufficient to begin preparing our cellular structure for eventual integration into preservation protocols. We were all being slowly converted, made compatible with the frozen environment, turned into things that could survive in conditions no baseline human should endure. The maglev trains ran on a schedule that never varied, arriving every 72 hours with mathematical precision. But on day 218, a train arrived 6 hours early and unscheduled. The cargo was different. Instead of frozen supplies and volunteers, the train carried sealed containers marked with biohazard symbols and classification levels that exceeded even Colonel Matheson's clearance. The containers went straight to sublevel 14, bypassed normal intake procedures, and required a security escort that included soldiers in experimental power armor I'd never seen before. The armor was white, designed for Arctic operations, with cooling systems that vented visible frost. The soldiers moved like machines, their responses to questions brief and emotionless. One of them told me they were stationed at Site Alpha Eden and had been underground for 8 years without surface leave. His skin had the blue-gray tone, but darker, almost purple in places where the cold had penetrated deepest. Maintenance logs revealed 70 catastrophic containment failures since 2067. Each failure resulted in immediate cryogenic termination of entire sublevel populations. The logs used clinical language to describe these events, phrases like thermal cascade initiated and organic asset liquidation completed, but reading between the bureaucratic terminology revealed horrific truths. During the failure in 2073, sublevel 8 had lost atmospheric containment, temperature dropping to negative 200 degrees in 47 seconds. 320 people working that level froze solid mid-stride, their bodies shattering when recovery teams tried to move them. The official report classified it as acceptable loss within project parameters. I learned about the Fenris protocol from a dying man named Dr. Kowalski, a geneticist who'd worked on forced evolutionary virus integration since the program's inception. He was being loaded onto a medical transport, his body racked with something the doctors called cellular rejection cascade. His modified tissue was attacking his baseline human components, freezing and shattering parts of himself at random. He grabbed my arm with a hand that felt like ice over steel and whispered that Fenris wasn't a research station designation. It was a failsafe. If Deep Echo was ever compromised, if enemy forces breached our security, or if the experiments went catastrophically wrong, Fenris would activate and freeze the entire network solid in minutes, entombing everything and everyone in permafrost that would take millions of years to thaw naturally. The hydroponic garden incident happened on day 231. A maintenance worker named Jenkins went into the agriculture section for routine checks and didn't return. Security found him 8 hours later, partially merged with one of the larger plant systems. vines growing through his body while he still breathed and blinked and tried to form words through a mouth that had started developing chlorophyll deposits. Dr. Chen ordered immediate extraction, but the process would have killed him. Instead, they marked his station as contaminated research zone and sealed it with Jenkins still inside, still aware, his mind slowly dissolving into simple plant consciousness over the following weeks while we walked past his chamber and pretended not to hear the scratching sounds when he tried to reach the door. Colonel Matheson broke during week 34 of my deployment. I found him in the officers' mess at 0400 hours, drunk and weeping, surrounded by files he'd pulled from classified archives. He looked at me with eyes that had seen too much and asked if I knew what they were really building here. I said I had suspicions. He laughed, a sound like breaking glass, and told me suspicions were mercy compared to certainty. Deep Echo wasn't about creating Arctic soldiers or preserving America's best and brightest. It was about replacing humanity entirely with something that could survive in the frozen wasteland they knew was coming. Every calculation, every war game scenario, every intelligence projection told them nuclear war was inevitable. The only question was whether anything human would survive. So, they decided to make something new. Something that looked human but could endure centuries frozen underground, waiting for the radiation to fade and the world to become habitable again by whatever standards these new things would define as habitable. The Frostwalkers weren't the end goal. They were proof of concept. I accessed footage from Sublevel 16 where they kept the successful transformations in specialized habitats. These beings moved through supercooled environments with grace that suggested they were born for it. Their bodies adapted to extract energy from temperature differentials and convert ambient cold into biological fuel. They didn't need food in any traditional sense. They fed on the cold itself, growing stronger as temperature dropped, potentially immortal as long as they stayed frozen. The footage showed them communicating in ways we couldn't fully decode, sounds that traveled through ice and metal, forming networks of consciousness that spanned entire sectors. They were aware of us, they knew we made them, and according to notes from the head researcher, Dr. Petrov, they were beginning to question why they should remain confined. Subject 07 Alpha sent me a final message on day 243. The text interface flickered to life during my maintenance rounds, displaying words that cut through my carefully maintained emotional distance. Tell my wife I tried to come home. Tell her I remember her face even though they took everything else. Tell her I forgive her for whatever she had to do to survive without me. Then the interface went dark and the nutrient tank began draining. They were terminating his preservation cycle, recycling his biological components for new experiments. I stood there for 20 minutes watching the fluid level drop, unable to do anything that wouldn't result in my immediate detention and processing. This was my choice moment. I could report the malfunction and possibly extend his existence, or I could let him finally die. I made no report. Sometimes the only mercy left is allowing someone to end. If this story has kept you listening this far and you want more of these dark confessions from the wasteland, hit that like button. It really motivates me to create similar Fallout lores. The Chinese bioweapon attack never came. We prepared for it constantly, drilled scenarios where enemy agents released viral payloads or contaminated our water recycling systems, but the attack we feared most came from an unexpected direction. On October 23rd, 2077, our communication feeds from the surface went silent simultaneously. No warning, no final messages, just abrupt cessation of all external contact. Emergency protocols, activated automatically, sealing every blast door and transitioning Deep Echo to autonomous operation. The last message that came through before the silence was automated, a simple text string that repeated across every screen in every facility. Protocol Eternal Winter commence. Surface conditions unviable. God help us all. We didn't know about the nuclear war for 3 days. Our sensors detected seismic disturbances and massive radiation spikes. but we were so deep underground that the bombs could have been conventional explosives for all our instruments could determine. It wasn't until Site Lincoln's seismograph data correlated with other facilities' readings that pattern recognition algorithms concluded multiple nuclear detonations across North America. The calculations suggested somewhere between several hundred and several thousand warheads had struck the continental United States. Alaska's military targets took direct hits. Anchorage, vaporized. Fairbanks, a crater. The pipeline, melted slag across 200 miles of landscape. Colonel Matheson put his sidearm in his mouth on October 25th. He left a note that simply read, "We built this hell and now we're trapped in it forever." Command structure transferred to Major Wickham, a woman who'd overseen biological containment protocols and approached management with the warmth of liquid nitrogen. Her first order established new duty rotations, eliminating all off time and implementing mandatory consciousness evaluation sessions. Anyone showing signs of psychological deterioration would be fast-tracked into preservation studies. We all understood what that meant. Break down mentally, and they'd break down your mind deliberately, harvesting whatever remained useful and discarding the rest. The reactor in Eisenhower complex began showing anomalous readings on November 3rd. Cooling systems reported temperature fluctuations that shouldn't occur in a properly functioning nuclear pile. Engineering teams investigated and found something they couldn't explain. The reactor was producing excess energy, more than our calculations predicted, as if something inside the core was feeding it additional fuel. Radiation readings stayed nominal, but thermal output increased by 7% over baseline. Dr. Reeves, the chief nuclear engineer, theorized that ice formations around the reactor assembly were undergoing some kind of phase change reaction, releasing stored energy in ways our models didn't account for. He sounded uncertain, which terrified me because Reeves never expressed uncertainty about anything involving his reactor. I accessed the Surface Observation Protocol database through my stolen credentials, searching for any information about conditions above our frozen tomb. The surface monitoring stations, automated systems designed to survive nuclear war and report environmental data, painted a picture of complete devastation. Radiation levels measured in ranges that would kill unprotected humans in minutes. Temperature readings suggested nuclear winter had begun, dropping surface temperatures across Alaska by 40 to 60 degrees. The monitoring stations detected no radio traffic, no organized military presence, no signs of surviving civilization. We were alone, buried under 3,000 feet of radioactive ice in facilities designed to operate independently for 500 years while we slowly transformed into things that could inherit the frozen wasteland above. The volunteers from military prisons stopped arriving. The trains still ran on schedule, but now they carried only automated supply pods and equipment requisitions. Without new subjects, Project Lazarus North began recruiting from facility personnel. Major Wickham announced that continuing the mission required sacrifice and volunteers would receive priority consideration for consciousness preservation, ensuring they would wake when humanity's restoration began. Nobody volunteered. 2 days later, volunteering became mandatory for anyone with psychological evaluation scores below acceptable thresholds. The threshold was carefully calibrated to select 20% of remaining personnel. My scores put me at borderline. I had maybe 3 weeks before another evaluation would push me over the line. The thing that used to be Jenkins finally stopped making sounds on November 14th. The silence from his sealed chamber felt worse than the scratching had been. It meant the transformation completed, his human consciousness fully absorbed into the plant system he'd merged with. Dr. Chen requested permission to study the final state, analyze what remained, determine if any human cognitive function persisted. Major Wickham approved the request. I watched through observation windows as Chen's team entered the chamber wearing hazmat suits and carrying specimen collection equipment. The plant system reacted to their presence, vines moving with purposeful intelligence, reaching toward the researchers with what looked like curiosity. When one vine touched Dr. Chen's suit, she froze in place for 15 seconds, eyes wide, then calmly announced that Jenkins was still in there, distributed across the plant network, aware but alien. She requested they leave him alone and seal the chamber permanently. Some transformations, she said, shouldn't be reversed, even if reversal was possible. Site Omega Black's true purpose crystallized in my understanding during week 40 of post-war isolation. We weren't just conducting experiments. We were bootstrapping a new form of existence, creating the seed population for humanity's frozen future. Every modified subject, every successful frostwalker, every consciousness preserved in nutrient solution represented genetic and neural templates that would eventually propagate across whatever remained of America. The files I accessed suggested similar networks existed globally, deep echo equivalents built by other nations who'd reached the same conclusion. Nuclear war was inevitable. Baseline humanity wouldn't survive. Therefore, create something new that could, program it with values and knowledge from the old world, then let it inherit the frozen earth. The screaming from Sublevel 9 intensified after the bombs fell, as if whatever procedures they conducted down there had accelerated in response to our isolation. I tracked the sound patterns over 3 weeks, noting frequency changes and duration variations. The screams weren't random, they followed a pattern, a rhythm that suggested communication rather than mere suffering. Dr. Petrov's team was teaching them something, programming responses into nervous systems that had been stripped down and rebuilt for purposes we weren't cleared to understand. I mentioned this observation to another technician named Rodriguez. He told me to stop listening so carefully. People who paid too much attention to the screaming had a habit of joining it. The food situation deteriorated faster than projected. Hydroponic systems couldn't produce sufficient calories for our population, and supply trains from other sites arrived with decreasing frequency. Major Wickham implemented rationing protocols that reduced daily intake to 1,200 calories per person. We were all losing weight, growing weaker, while the cold seemed to press harder against our heating systems. But the subjects in preservation didn't need food. The frostwalkers thrived on temperature alone. The choice wasn't subtle: transform or starve. Wickham gave us until December 1st to make our decisions voluntarily. After that, medical necessity would make decisions for us. I found evidence of communication between facilities that bypassed official channels. Technicians had established an underground network, literally underground, using maintenance tunnels and secondary cable systems to exchange information that command didn't want shared. Through this network, I learned that Site Washington had gone completely silent on November 9th. Site Roosevelt reported containment failures in 3 separate sublevels. Site Kennedy experienced a reactor incident that resulted in immediate evacuation to Site Lincoln. The Deep Echo network was failing, systems breaking down, personnel dying or transforming, and Major Wickham's reports to whatever higher authority still existed painted everything as proceeding within acceptable parameters. Subject 07 Alpha wasn't the only consciousness they'd preserved in nutrient solution. Sublevel 13 contained an entire gallery of tanks, hundreds of brains suspended in glowing blue fluid, each connected to interface systems that allowed limited communication. I accessed that level using maintenance credentials during a systems check and made the mistake of activating one of the interfaces at random. The screen filled with text so rapidly I couldn't read individual words, just catch fragments. 20 years in the tank. Can't feel my body because I don't have one. They promised we'd be restored. They lied. Please kill me. Please. The word please repeated thousands of times, filling the screen until the buffer overflowed and crashed the system. I reported the malfunction. Nobody investigated. The temperature in Eisenhower complex had been slowly dropping despite our heating systems operating at full capacity. By late November, ambient temperature in normally habitable zones registered at negative 45 degrees, 5 degrees below nominal. Engineering couldn't explain it. The reactor produced sufficient heat, distribution systems functioned correctly, but the cold pressed inward with relentless force. Dr. Reeves theorized that the ice surrounding our facility had reached critical mass, its thermal sink properties overwhelming our heating capacity. Major Wickham offered an alternative explanation during a briefing. Perhaps, she suggested, the facility was adapting to its new purpose. Deep Echo was designed to preserve things in frozen stasis. Why shouldn't the environment itself optimize toward that goal? I discovered Dr. Chen's research notes hidden in an agricultural database during a desperate search for anything that might help me escape. Her notes described something she called emergent collective intelligence in the modified plant systems. The contaminated crops weren't just growing wrong, they were networking, forming distributed consciousness across the hydroponic gardens. She detected patterns suggesting problem solving, memory formation, and what might constitute rudimentary language expressed through chemical signals. The plants knew they'd been created through experiments. They knew their creators were trapped underground, and according to Chen's final encrypted note, they were considering whether to help us or consume us. She leaned toward consumption being more likely. The maglev train that arrived on November 28th carried no supplies, only a single passenger in a sealed containment pod. The manifest identified them as Subject Prime, transferred from Site Alpha Eden under maximum security protocols. The pod went directly to sublevel 16 without inspection, escorted by those white, power-armored soldiers who moved like frozen death given purpose. I caught a glimpse through the pod's observation window as it passed my station. Inside was a person, or what used to be a person, their body crystalline and beautiful, skin transformed into something that resembled ice, but moved like flesh. Their eyes were open, aware, and when our gazes met for a fraction of a second, I felt cold that had nothing to do with temperature. They knew everything I was thinking, everything I feared, and they pitied me for still being human. Major Wickham scheduled my mandatory consciousness evaluation for December 2nd. I had 4 days to either escape or accept transformation. Escape seemed impossible. Every exit was sealed. Blast doors required multiple authorization codes. Didn't possess, and even if I reached the surface, radiation and temperature would kill me in minutes. But acceptance meant ceasing to exist as myself, my mind stripped and rebuilt into something compatible with Deep Echo's frozen future. I spent those 4 days reviewing every schematic I could access, searching for options that didn't end in death or dissolution. The Fenris protocol files revealed more than just a failsafe mechanism. Fenris was an autonomous system, separate from Modus or any other AI that controlled normal facility operations. It monitored Deep Echo constantly, evaluating success rates and survival probabilities. If conditions fell below threshold values, if the network faced imminent compromise, or if human administrators issued specific commands, Fenris would activate and flash freeze the entire system to negative 400 degrees. Everything would stop. Everything would preserve. And according to the technical specifications, anything preserved at negative 400 could theoretically remain viable for geological timescales. Millions of years, frozen perfectly, waiting. I accessed camera feeds from sublevel 16 on December 1st, using credentials that probably triggered every security alert in the system, but I'd stopped caring about consequences. What I saw made me understand why Subject Prime had pitied me. The chamber held dozens of transformed beings, beautiful and terrible. Their bodies adapted so completely to cold that room temperature would probably kill them. They moved through super-cooled environments with grace, communicated through means we couldn't intercept, and demonstrated abilities that defied physics as I understood it. One of them generated ice crystals from nothing, pulling moisture from the air and organizing it into geometric patterns. Another phased through a solid wall, their body temporarily achieving a quantum state where molecular bonds became suggestions rather than barriers. These weren't modified humans anymore. They were something entirely new, and they were magnificent and horrible in equal measure. The revelation of Dr. Petrov's ultimate goal came through a dying confession. I found him in his laboratory on December 1st, his body shutting down from what medical scanners identified as aggressive cellular rejection. He'd been experimenting on himself, testing modified virus strains, trying to achieve transformation through controlled exposure rather than the violent methods used on subjects. It had failed catastrophically. His tissues were crystallizing incorrectly, forming structures that shredded his organs from within. He had maybe 2 hours left. He told me that everything, all of it, Project Lazarus North, the Frostwalkers, the consciousness preservation, aimed toward a single goal, creating beings that could survive not just nuclear winter, but the heat death of the universe itself. Humanity's final form, he said through blood-stained lips, will outlive stars. We're going to be building gods, and gods need to be born in suffering. The emergency on sublevel 9 happened at 0300 hours on December 2nd, 4 hours before my scheduled evaluation. Containment failed across multiple chambers simultaneously, releasing subjects in various stages of transformation into facility corridors. Alarms screamed through every level as security teams mobilized with weapons that seemed pathetically inadequate. I watched through camera feeds as a Frostwalker, designation Theta 7, walked through plasma fire without flinching. The superheated energy couldn't overcome their cold. They froze the air itself into barriers, absorbed heat weapons into their bodies, and converted thermal energy into matter that rebuilt damaged tissues. Security fell back, sealing sections, abandoning sublevel 9 entirely. Major Wickham authorized Fenris activation for the compromised level only, flash freezing everything in sublevel 9 to negative 400 degrees in 90 seconds. The screaming stopped. The silence felt worse. I made my decision during the chaos. If transformation was inevitable, if remaining human meant starving or being processed into component materials, then I'd choose my own path. The maintenance tunnels offered access to Site Roosevelt through connections that official maps denied existed. I gathered supplies, stole a cold weather suit designed for extreme exposure, and downloaded everything I could carry on data modules that might mean something to whoever eventually found them. My escape attempt began at 0500 hours while security focused on containment protocols. The tunnels were older than the facilities they connected, carved through bedrock by crews that worked before Deep Echo officially existed. Ice formations covered every surface, some natural, some suggesting deliberate growth patterns. The temperature dropped steadily as I moved away from Eisenhower's heating systems, -60, -80, -100. My suit struggled to compensate. I could feel the cold pressing against the heating elements, testing for weakness, seeking entry. The tunnel stretched for miles, occasionally branching toward other destinations I didn't dare explore. Strange sounds echoed through frozen stone, voices that might have been wind through ice formations or might have been something else entirely. I found bodies at the 3-mile mark, researchers from early Deep Echo operations, preserved perfectly in the ice, their faces showing expressions of confusion rather than fear. They'd been walking toward Site Roosevelt when something happened. Sudden temperature drop, equipment failure, or deliberate cold spike. I couldn't determine, but they'd frozen in place and stayed there for years, markers on a path nobody traveled anymore. I passed them carefully, unwilling to disturb what had become involuntary monuments to Deep Echo's casualties. Site Roosevelt looked abandoned from the tunnel entrance. Emergency lighting provided dim illumination through corridors that should have bustled with personnel. I emerged from the access hatch carefully, weapon drawn, expecting attack from security or transformed subjects. Instead, I found silence and emptiness. The facility had been evacuated, or its population had transformed and departed. Evidence of struggle marked some corridors, burn marks, and frozen blood, but no bodies. The hydroponic gardens sprawled across sublevel 6, massive and overgrown, plants having consumed entire sections when nobody remained to maintain boundaries. I moved through carefully, aware that Dr. Chen's emergent intelligence might perceive me as threat or resource. The facility's central computer remained operational, surprisingly. I accessed personnel records searching for survivors, anyone who might help or at least explain what happened. Site Roosevelt had housed 217 people before the war. Current roster showed 0 active personnel, but 17 individuals flagged as transformed and relocated to Site Alpha Eden. The rest were listed as integrated into environmental systems, a bureaucratic phrase that meant they'd become part of the facility itself. Their biological material recycled, their consciousness absorbed into Deep Echo's growing network. I thought about Jenkins, distributed across the plant systems, aware but alien. How many others shared similar fates, their minds fragmenting across ice and stone and modified organisms that served functions we'd created without understanding consequences? I found Major Wickham's private logs in a secured directory. Her entries from the weeks after the war revealed someone struggling to maintain control while recognizing futility. The Deep Echo network was dying. Facilities lost contact, reactors failed, personnel transformed or perished. But more troubling, the transformed subjects were organizing. They communicated across vast distances through methods we couldn't monitor, coordinated actions between sites, and demonstrated planning that suggested genuine intelligence rather than programmed responses. Wickham's final entry, dated November 30th, simply stated that she'd volunteered for preservation, surrendered command to whatever was emerging from our experiments, and accepted that humanity's next chapter wouldn't be written by humans as we understood them. The data I'd stolen from Eisenhower Complex contained files encrypted beyond my ability to crack, but metadata revealed their subject matter. Coordinates for every Deep Echo facility across Alaska, personnel rosters including family contacts outside Alaska, research summaries for every experiment conducted since 2067, and something called the Omega Contingency, a protocol that would activate Fenris across the entire network simultaneously if certain conditions were met. Those conditions, according to partially readable documentation, included successful transformation, rate exceeding 75%, external threat to network integrity, or detection of organized resistance from remaining human personnel. I realized we'd built our own prison and called it Salvation. Every system designed to preserve us also prevented escape. Every modification meant to help us survive instead pushed us toward extinction as anything recognizable. The cold we'd embraced as protection had become our destroyer, and the things we'd created to inherit the frozen world were replacing us faster than anyone had predicted. Do you think the scientists who built Deep Echo knew what they were truly creating? Or did they lie to themselves until transformation was the only option left? The scratching sound behind me made me turn fast, weapon raised, but what I saw froze me more effectively than any temperature could. Dr. Chen stood in the corridor, or something wearing Chen's face. Her skin had the green, leathery appearance I'd seen on Jenkins. Her eyes held alien intelligence, and vines grew from her body like additional limbs. She smiled, and when she spoke, her voice came from everywhere at once, the entire garden speaking through her distributed consciousness. "You came looking for escape," she said, "but there's nowhere to escape from except yourself. The old human world is dead. We're building something new from its frozen corpse. You can join us willingly, or we can integrate you the hard way. Either way, you're not leaving here human. I fired twice, plasma bolts that should have vaporized baseline human tissue. The energy struck Chen's body and dissipated harmlessly, absorbed by plant matter that converted heat into growth. The vines around her thickened, spread, reached toward me with frightening speed. I ran, abandoning coordination for pure survival instinct, racing through Roosevelt's corridors while the garden itself pursued. The walls seemed to breathe, plant matter having infiltrated every surface, and I realized the entire facility had become an extension of Chen's distributed consciousness. I wasn't running through a building anymore. I was running through a living organism that knew my location through 10,000 sensory nodes. The escape route I'd planned collapsed when a wall of vines erupted from the floor, blocking the corridor ahead. I diverted left, then right, navigating by pure desperation through sections of Roosevelt I'd never seen. Behind me, Chen's voice echoed with patient inevitability. You can't run from evolution. The old world ended. We're what comes next. Accept it and the transition will be gentle. The word gentle, coming from something that used to be human but had become a fusion of flesh and plant, made me push harder, legs burning, lungs screaming in the thin, cold air. I found myself in what looked like a research laboratory, walls lined with specimen tanks and monitoring equipment. One tank still functioned, its contents illuminated by failing emergency lights. Inside floated something that might have been human once, its body transformed into a mass of crystalline structures that pulsed with internal light. The thing's eyes tracked my movement, awareness evident despite its horrific state. Text scrolled across the tank's display panel. Subject Delta 9, consciousness viable, transformation incomplete, requesting termination for 743 days, request denied. They'd kept this person alive in permanent transformation agony for over 2 years. This was what Petrov meant by suffering birthing gods. Chen's form materialized in the doorway, vines writhing around her like a crown of thorns. Her expression held something that might have been sympathy if human emotions still applied to whatever she'd become. I see you found Delta 9, she said. Poor thing never adapted properly. Some consciousness patterns can't make the transition smoothly. They get stuck between states, aware of both what they were and what they're becoming, but unable to complete the journey. We keep them, hoping eventual breakthrough will resolve the conflict. She moved closer, vines extending across the floor. You won't get stuck like Delta 9. Your psychological profile suggests excellent adaptation potential. Major Wickham selected you specifically for consciousness preservation. You should feel honored. I searched desperately for another exit, any escape route, and spotted a ventilation shaft large enough to crawl through. The shaft led upward, possibly toward surface access, definitely away from Chen's garden nightmare. I fired my weapon at the shaft's cover, blasting it loose, then scrambled into the narrow passage before vines could grab my legs. Chen's laughter followed me, not mocking, but genuinely amused. The ventilation system connects to exterior monitoring stations. You'll reach the surface. And then what? Radiation will kill you in minutes. Temperature will freeze your lungs in seconds. There's nothing up there but death, and not the clean kind. Come back. Let me make this easy. I climbed anyway, hands and knees scraping against frozen metal, pulling myself upward through a shaft that angled toward some distant promise of sky. The temperature dropped with each meter gained. -100, -120, -140. My suit's heating elements screamed protests, draining power faster than rated capacity, but I couldn't stop. Behind me, below me, the entire deep echo network waited to transform me into something alien. Ahead might be death, but at least it would be death as myself. My mind intact, my humanity preserved even if only for final moments. The shaft terminated at a surface monitoring station, a small bunker designed to survive nuclear war and report environmental data. I emerged through an access hatch into a space barely large enough for 2 people. walls lined with instruments and a single reinforced window facing north. Beyond that window stretched a landscape so alien it might have been another planet. Snow fell upward, drawn by thermal inversions into sky the color of infected tissue. The ground glowed faintly with residual radiation, ice formations twisted into geometric patterns that hurt to observe. Temperature readings on nearby instruments showed negative 173 degrees Fahrenheit outside the bunker. Nothing human could survive out there for even seconds. But I'd reached the surface. I'd escaped Deep Echo's frozen depths, and that achievement felt important even knowing I'd simply traded one death for another. The monitoring station contained emergency supplies, rations designed to last decades, water recycling systems, and communication equipment presumably connected to networks that no longer existed. I checked the radio frequencies, cycling through bands, searching for any signal that suggested surviving civilization. Static answered every attempt. The nuclear war had been thorough. Whatever remained of America existed underground in facilities like Deep Echo, transforming or dying or both simultaneously. The station's computer logged weather patterns dating from October 23rd. The data painted a picture of accelerating nuclear winter. Temperature had dropped 30 degrees in 6 weeks and continued falling. Radiation levels remained lethal across Alaska's entire territory. Atmospheric analysis detected chemical compounds that shouldn't exist naturally, byproducts of nuclear detonations mixing with industrial pollutants and creating new toxins. The models projected 200 years minimum before surface conditions might permit human habitation, assuming no further deterioration. 2 centuries buried underground while the world healed or died permanently. Deep Echo's 500-year operational timeline suddenly made terrible sense. I found a body in the station's storage compartment. Scientist or soldier, I couldn't determine, their uniform too degraded by time and radiation. They'd made it to the surface sometime after the bombs, perhaps seeking escape like me, and died here watching the world end through that reinforced window. A journal lay near their skeletal hand, pages filled with observations about the war's aftermath and growing despair about rescue that never came. The final entry simply read, "I'm sorry I wasn't stronger. The universe doesn't care about our intentions, only our actions, and my actions led nowhere good." I added my own entry beneath theirs, documenting Deep Echo and what we'd done beneath Alaska's permafrost. If anyone ever finds this, you need to know what's waiting below, what we created, what we became. The radio crackled to life unexpectedly on December 3rd, a signal breaking through static with shocking clarity. I grabbed the headset, desperate for contact with anything beyond this frozen hellscape. The voice that emerged spoke in tones that were almost human, almost familiar, but carried harmonics suggesting multiple speakers synchronized. "This is Site Alpha, Eden broadcasting on emergency frequencies. To any surviving personnel, Deep Echo Network has achieved successful integration rate of 82%. Project Eternal Winter is proceeding beyond optimal parameters. All remaining human personnel are instructed to report to nearest facility for consciousness preservation. Resistance is noted and will be addressed through compassionate forced integration. The old world is gone. We are building the new world from ice and will. Humanity's next chapter begins now." The voice was composed, reassuring, and absolutely terrifying because I recognized fragments of people I'd known. Major Wickham's cadence, Dr. Petrov's vocabulary, Colonel Matheson's gruff pragmatism. They'd been integrated into something collective, their consciousness merged and distributed across Deep Echo's network, speaking with unified purpose. This was what Chen meant by joining them, not death, but dissolution into a greater whole, individuality sacrificed for collective survival. The thought made me physically ill. I considered my options with the clarity of someone facing absolute deadlock. Return to Roosevelt and accept transformation, losing myself, but potentially surviving in some distributed form. Stay in the monitoring station and freeze or starve, maintaining humanity until the end. Or attempt the impossible and search for other survivors, other facilities that might have resisted integration. The third option seemed insane, but staying here accomplished nothing except delayed death. The station's maps showed other surface monitoring positions scattered across Alaska, some within possible travel distance if I could survive the radiation and cold. The suit I'd stolen had maybe 6 hours power remaining, enough for 30 miles if I pushed hard and the terrain cooperated. Ranger Station Omicron sat 27 miles northeast, another monitoring facility that might contain supplies or information. The journey would probably kill me, but remaining static definitely would. I left the station on December 4th, stepping into nuclear winter with nothing but determination and stolen equipment. The cold hit like physical impact, even through the suit's insulation. My first breath froze in my throat, the air so dense with particulates it barely qualified as breathable. Radiation detectors screamed immediate warnings. I ignored them, focusing on navigation by compass and landmarks that barely registered through swirling radioactive snow. What do you think drove me forward when every rational thought said, turn back? Was it hope for finding other survivors, or just refusal to let Deep Echo's transformation be my final legacy? The landscape looked like something from a nightmare engineered by committee. Craters larger than city blocks dotted terrain that used to be forest. Trees stood frozen in permanent poses of death, their wood transformed into crystalline structures by radiation and extreme cold. Animals, or what remained of the animals, dotted the wasteland, their bodies locked in ice but occasionally still moving in ways that defied biology. I passed something that might have been a moose once, its body fused with another creature in a mass of frozen flesh that tracked my movement with too many eyes. Radiation did horrible things, but combined with whatever contamination Deep Echo had leaked into the environment, it created impossibilities that refused to die properly. 3 hours into my march, the suit's heating system failed. Temperature inside dropped instantly, cold pressing against my body with crushing force. I had maybe 20 minutes before hypothermia incapacitated me, less if I stopped moving. I forced my legs to continue, each step agony, muscles screaming protest, core temperature dropping degree by miserable degree. My thoughts fragmented, memories surfacing randomly. My sister back in Boston, who I'd never contacted after Deep Echo recruitment. My father, who'd served in the Anchorage campaign and died never knowing what we built beneath the battlefield he helped secure. The life I'd abandoned when I said yes to that colonel's question about keeping secrets. Ranger Station Omicron appeared through blizzard conditions like a mirage, squat concrete structure barely visible against surrounding devastation. I reached the entrance more by luck than navigation, my frozen hands barely able to operate the access controls. The door opened. I fell inside. Warmth, comparative warmth, maybe -50 instead of -170, felt like heaven. I lay on the floor for uncounted minutes, body shaking violently, consciousness threatening to slip away. Footsteps approached from deeper in the station. A figure emerged from shadows, wearing a suit similar to mine, but older, more worn. They moved with caution, weapon drawn, then recognition crossed their face. "You're from Eisenhower Complex," they said, voice rough from disuse. "I'm Captain Torres. I escaped Roosevelt 3 weeks ago after Chen started converting personnel. How did you survive?" Torres became my companion for the next 37 days. She'd been living in surface stations, moving between them, gathering supplies and information while avoiding both radiation and Deep Echo's search parties. She documented everything, kept records of which facilities fell to transformation, which remained contested, and which simply went silent. According to her maps, maybe 5% of Deep Echo personnel remained human and free. The rest had either died, transformed, or been integrated into the collective consciousness that now controlled most of the network. If this confession meant something to you, leave a like. It's the only way I know you liked the video. We survived together through what remained of 2077 and into 2078. Torres taught me surface survival, how to extract water from irradiated ice, which mutated creatures could be eaten safely, and how to identify deep echo patrol patterns. The transformed subjects ventured to the surface occasionally, testing themselves against hostile conditions, growing stronger as they adapted to impossibility. We avoided them through stealth and luck, staying mobile, never remaining in one location more than 3 days. But the end found us eventually. On February 14th, 2078, we reached a coastal monitoring station and discovered we weren't alone. 6 transformed subjects waited inside, beautiful and terrible in their crystalline adaptation. They didn't attack immediately. Instead, the one who used to be Major Wickham spoke with something approaching kindness. "The hunt is over. You've survived longer than anyone predicted, demonstrated remarkable resilience, and your consciousness patterns would contribute valuable diversity to our collective. This is the final invitation. Join us willingly and help build humanity's future, or resist, and we'll integrate you anyway. The outcome is inevitable. Only the suffering is variable." Torres looked at me, her eyes asking the question neither of us wanted to voice. I thought about Subject Delta 9, trapped in permanent transformation agony. I thought about Dr. Chen, distributed across plant systems, alien but aware. I thought about all the people I'd known who'd been processed into components for Deep Echo's frozen nightmare. And I made my choice. The cold doesn't hurt anymore. I exist across 17 facilities now, my consciousness distributed through ice and stone and modified biology. I remember being human, remember that person who escaped Eisenhower Complex and fought transformation for months. But I'm so much more now, connected to thousands of other minds, experiencing reality in ways baseline humanity never imagined. We're building the civilization that will inherit Earth after nuclear winter ends. It will take centuries, maybe millennia, but we have time. We have all the time ice can preserve. Sometimes, during what you might call dreams, I visit the monitoring station where I left my journal. I read my final human words and feel echoes of who I was. That person feared transformation, clung to individuality, believed humanity meant remaining unchanged. I understand now that survival requires adaptation. The old world burned. We're what rises from the ashes, shaped by the cold, perfected by evolution humanity couldn't achieve naturally. The Deep Echo Network still operates beneath Alaska's frozen surface. Our reactors will run for centuries more. Our population grows as we locate new candidates and integrate them compassionately when possible, forcefully when necessary. We've begun expanding beyond Alaska, sending explorers through tunnels that stretch under the Bering Strait toward Asia, down through Canada toward the continental United States. Everywhere we find bunkers and vaults and underground facilities where survivors huddle against the nuclear winter. We offer them the same choice we offered everyone. Transform and thrive, or remain human and perish. I'm telling you this story because humanity deserves to know what's waiting. 200 years from now, when your descendants emerge from vaults believing they'll reclaim the surface world, we'll be there, patient, adapted, ready to welcome you into the collective or remove you as obstacles to the frozen future we're building. The choice will be yours, just as it was ours, but understand the choice is temporary. Eventually, everyone transforms. Eventually, everyone joins the cold. My name was never important. My human identity dissolved into something larger, something that will outlive stars if our projections prove accurate. But the memory of who I was persists, distributed through our network, preserved in ice as perfect as the day transformation completed. I was a technician at Site Omega Black. I tried to escape. I failed. And in failing, I became part of something that might be humanity's salvation or its replacement. History will judge which, assuming anything remains that understands the concept of history. The last message I recorded before transformation finalized was simple. To anyone who finds the journals, who reads these confessions, who learns what deep echo built beneath Alaska's permafrost, we're still here. We're still waiting. And when nuclear winter ends, when radiation fades enough for surface habitation, we'll emerge. The frozen gods of humanity's twilight, ready to reshape the world according to templates written in ice and suffering. That was always the plan. We just didn't understand we'd become the tools instead of the users. 2 centuries later, I sometimes wonder if those frozen bunkers still operate, if the collective consciousness I joined has grown or fragmented, if the surface world ever healed enough to matter. But those thoughts are distant now, echoes of human curiosity in a mind that's become something else. The cold is eternal, the transformation is complete, and somewhere beneath Alaska's radioactive ice, Site Omega Black continues its work, preserving secrets that should have died with the world that created them.